We are going to finish configuring the start screen to spawn our VR pawn. This is an extensible framework that can allow you to support desktop, VR, and other alternate pawns in the future. We're going to start by implementing the blueprint interface we created earlier into our game mode. We'll then set up an event we created to handle what to do when the end user presses play. Next, we will set up the button in the start menu to call that event in the game mode. Lastly, we are going to discuss an important point when working with widgets. First, we need to undo a change we made in a previous course. Open our GM_Studio Showcase and reset the default pawn to be our BPC_starter pawn. Open the full blueprint editor and select class settings so we can implement the BPI Studio Showcase interface. Right-click to create a new function. Search for Event User Selects Pawn. Let's comment that this will be called when user starts the game. This event is going to be called from the interface when a user selects, when available, the type of pawn they would like to use. When it gets this call, we will want it to get the transform of the starter pawn, destroy it, spawn the new pawn, possess it, and destroy the starting screen. Before we build this, let's make sure our button is calling the game mode when it is pressed. Go to the UMG folder, the start screen folder, and open W_start screen. Currently, the button is simply calling a print string function to test it. Delete that print string. Right-click and get a reference to the game mode. Cast this to GM Studio Showcase. As GM Studio Showcase, we'll call the User Selects Pawn event and comment that this button is only set up for VR and it will always spawn VR pawn. Set pawn VR to true and compile. Go back to the GM Studio Showcase. We need a new variable to remember the starting transform so we can spawn the VR pawn in the right place. Call this variable start pawn transform and make it of type transform. Place this into the category pawn. For us to be able to call the current possessed pawn, we need to get a reference to the player pawn, and even though we know it is starter pawn, it is a good habit to cast regardless for tracking down bugs. So let's cast to BPC_starter pawn. And as BPC starter pawn, search for get actor transform and set our new starter pawn transform to this value. Select all the nodes here and collapse them to a function and name it get start transform and destroy. Again, as BPC starter pawn, grab a destroy actor node and connect it. The order here is very important. We first want to get the transform and then we want to destroy it. If we had accidentally done it the other way around, there would be no transform to get. And I know it sounds obvious, but it does happen a lot. After we run this function, we want to spawn the new pawn. Add a spawn actor from class node. Drag off the class and we'll select it based on the value of the bool. If it's true, as in start in VR, we'll spawn our VR pawn. If it's false, spawn our PC pawn. Plug in the starter pawn transform into the spawn transform input. We need to possess this pawn somehow, and because we are not typing the class in directly, Unreal Engine does not know that it will be spawning a pawn, so we need to cast to the pawn. Drag out of the return value and let's cast to our BPP pawn. We can do this because both the PC and VR pawns are children of this class. Get a reference to the player controller and search for possess. Plug that into the cast node. Comment that this will spawn pawn based on user selection, currently only VR. Let's test to make sure everything is working as expected. In the map, press play. Search for BPC in the world outliner, and you'll see that BPC starter pawn is spawned. If I click to start the game in VR and look at our search results again, BPC starter pawn is gone and BPC VR pawn is in. A quick note as to why the camera is on the ground. Remember that our pawn uses the floor level to offset the camera position in VR. So what you're seeing is the correct outcome. The last function we need to add here is to get rid of the starter screen. Go back to the game mode and add a Remove All Widgets node to the end and comment that it is removing the start screen. Notice that the node is named Remove All Widgets and not Destroy All Widgets. This is an important difference. Destroying an actor, like we did with the starter pawn, removes the reference of it from memory and is destroyed and gone. We cannot communicate with it anymore. Widgets, on the other hand, they are in memory and cannot be destroyed until an event such as closing the game or changing maps is performed. If they are in memory, they are active and can receive events and communication or affect the game and pull down your memory. Be aware of that and make sure that, in general, widgets should only be messengers for your game and sending data to other blueprints for managing and processing. Go back to the map and press play again. After you click the start button, our pawn is destroyed, our new one is spawned and possessed, and the menu is gone. As your projects become more and more advanced, keep in mind the importance of planning out your requirements beforehand and using techniques like interfaces to make developing easier, quicker, and more extensible. Next, we will begin building the assets needed for the navigation map.